Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You've sent us on a fascinating journey this time, really fascinating. We're unpacking what makes the modern world tick.
Yeah, ambitious.
We're talking about a blend of historical and philosophical texts. We've got critiques of religion, even straight-up revolutionary manifestos.
It's a bit like piecing together a giant puzzle, wouldn't you say? We're talking about major historical turning points, big thinkers, and radical ideas that shape how we see the world, going all the way back to the Middle Ages.
Okay, so where do we even begin with something so massive, so much ground to cover?
Well, one of the early shifts, one that really sets the stage, is this divergence between Eastern and Western Christianity, even before that official split.
So before the schism.
Exactly, before the schism.
So it's not just about, like, different doctrines, right?
Yeah.
But a whole different way of thinking in the East versus the West.
Exactly. Our sources highlight how Eastern Christianity was so deeply rooted in tradition and inner spiritual experience.
Okay.
For example, Kirievsky, he talks about how the Western or Roman mind gravitated toward, the outward order of logical concepts.
So as the Western world develops, it becomes more and more focused on applying reason and logic to, well, everything, even to matters of faith.
And that plays out in fascinating ways. Take, for example, the interpretation of poverty. In the East, poverty was primarily an internal virtue, a detachment from worldly possessions. But figures like St. Francis in the West, they emphasized actually being poor, living a life of austerity.
It's like their understanding of faith became much more external. It was about outward actions rather than just an inner state.
Precisely. And this shift toward the outward ripples through everything. How faith was taught, how saints were venerated, even the evolution of religious art. Early icons, you see, they depicted saints in this heavenly, almost otherworldly way. But with St. Francis and his followers, you see this move towards earthly scenes, emotions, even the beauty of everyday life.
So interesting. It's like they were shifting their focus from the eternal to the temporal, from heaven to earth.
And this brings us right to the Age of Enlightenment, where reason really takes center stage. At this point, faith itself is being put on trial, judged by the standards of logic.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Thinkers like Voltaire and Hume come to mind. They were all about this natural religion based on reason, right?
Yeah.
And they were deeply skeptical of miracles, dogma, anything that couldn't be explained rationally.
And we've got some great quotes in our sources. Voltaire, for instance, he argues that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, so basically impossible.
Right.
Hume goes even further. He says it's logically impossible to prove a supernatural event.
So you have this rise of deism, this idea of a clockwork universe governed by, natural laws, with God as a distant clockmaker who sets it all in motion and steps back.
And yet,
Yeah.
alongside this increasingly rationalistic worldview, you see this explosion of art and music. We're talking Bach, Mozart, Baroque architecture, not exactly what you'd expect from a purely logical mindset.
Such a fascinating paradox. It's like human creativity, it finds a way to flourish even when religious belief becomes more, well, superficial is a strong word, but,
More rationalized, perhaps.
yes, more rationalized.
But the seeds of the Enlightenment, those discontents of reason, as we've called them, they eventually lead to something far more turbulent: revolution.
Because if you truly believe in reason and individual autonomy, as these Enlightenment thinkers did, it can lead to some pretty radical conclusions about how society should be structured.
Yeah, and these weren't just abstract ideas confined to universities. They were being debated in secret societies like the Illuminati.
Oh, the Illuminati.
Yes, the
Right.
Illuminati. They believed in creating a new world order based on reason, on radical social change, even if it meant using, as they put it, pious fraud.
Secret societies, pious fraud sounds like something straight out of a Dan Brown novel.
Yeah.
But it really goes to show how these ideas were starting to take root, but in powerful ways.
And then you have figures like Babeuf and his fiery Manifesto of Equals, calling for radical equality, the abolition of hierarchies. These were ideas that would have been unthinkable just a few generations earlier.
And of course, these ideas, they didn't stay on paper. They fueled real social and political upheaval, culminating in, well, the French Revolution.
Which, as our sources vividly portray, was a chaotic, often brutal affair. It's a stark reminder that even revolutions fought in the name of reason and liberty can have unintended and devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And out of that chaos emerges Napoleon, right? This figure who both embodies and attempts to control the very forces unleashed by the revolution. He's this brilliant military strategist, incredibly ambitious, but also with this almost religious appeal to the masses.
He's a fascinating study in contradictions, isn't he? A product of the Enlightenment who becomes, well, a new kind of emperor.
Our sources have some great stories about him. He was a Catholic, yet he supposedly said he preferred Islam because it wasn't as absurd as our religion. I mean, talk about a controversial statement.
Sure. He definitely had a pragmatic view of faith, seeing the church as a tool for social order. But interestingly enough, he also advanced the emancipation of Jews, which is another recurring theme in these revolutionary movements.
So with Napoleon, we see this fascinating bridge between the ideals of the revolution and the realities of power. He's riding the wave of change, but also trying to steer it in his own direction.
And all this while new visions of utopia are taking root, ranging from idealistic socialism to some pretty dark prophecies about the future of humanity.
That's a perfect segue. Let's talk about those utopian visions and how they play into this evolving story of, well, us.
So yeah, utopian visions, we were talking about those, right?
Sure.
It's like this impulse to create a perfect society.
Yeah, a heaven on earth kind of thing.
Exactly. Think about someone like Robert Owen. He was all about creating these utopian communities, right? Based on shared labor and social harmony.
Kind of a secular take on those earlier religious communes, those intentional communities we talked about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And Owen was actually inspired by groups like the Shakers and Rappites, which shows you this enduring human desire, right, to build a heaven on earth. But our sources point out that this utopian impulse, it has a shadow side as well.
Right. Like, for example, the ideas of someone like Saint Simon. He envisioned a society run by a technocratic elite, almost like, a precursor to those dystopian novels we see in the 20th century.
Exactly. And he promoted this idea of a new Christianity, one focused on social progress and tackling poverty. So again, we see religion being reinterpreted, but this time through the lens of these new social and scientific ideas. Of course, all this revolutionary fervor, all this talk of radical change, it triggered a conservative backlash as well. Thinkers like Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, they argued for tradition, right? They argued for order. They cautioned against all this radical change.
It seems like, though, they were trying to hold back a tidal wave, you know what I mean? The world was changing too fast.
Exactly. Their arguments often felt, well, I guess you could say, out of sync with the rapid transformations happening around them. And that wave, that momentum, it carries us into the 19th century, into this period of intense, and I mean intense questioning, the rise of nihilism, the idea of the death of God, and this desperate search for new sources of meaning. It's a fascinating period.
Yeah, and Nietzsche really becomes a central figure in all of this, doesn't he? His famous line, "God is dead," really captures that sense of, a world stripped of its old certainties.
It's a powerful image. And it wasn't just philosophy, the theory of evolution, right? While a scientific breakthrough, of course, it also acted as this powerful social force. It challenged these long-held religious beliefs about the origin and purpose of humanity. I mean, think about it. If we're just products of this long, blind process of natural selection, as Darwin argued, the old narratives about creation and divine purpose, they start to fall apart. So then what? What are we left with?
Right. It's like, what's the point anymore if we're just a cosmic accident?
That's the question that haunts the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it's so interesting, actually, how this perceived emptiness, this loss of faith, it leads to a resurgence of occultism, of spiritualism.
Really? It seems so counterintuitive. Like, reason seems to have triumphed, but then people are turning to mediums and seances and all these esoteric practices. It's like they're desperate for some connection to something, some realm, I guess, beyond the material world.
And we see it everywhere. We see prominent figures like Thomas Mann attending seances, Madame Blavatsky founding the Theosophical Society, this growing fascination with Eastern religions. It's like all signs point to this deep human yearning for something more. And what's remarkable is how this inward turn coincides with, the rise of psychoanalysis and what you call the cult of the self.
Right.
Freud's emphasis on the unconscious, on the power of personal experience over, external authority. It's fascinating. It's like therapy itself becomes a new kind of religion.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like we're seeing this pattern throughout history, this constant tension between these external structures of authority and then the individual's search for meaning.
Absolutely. And this tension, it only intensifies with the rise of mass media, particularly radio.
Oh, yeah. Radio.
Elo's work, which you wisely included, really highlights radio's power, right? To shape consciousness, to fragment attention, even to manipulate opinion.
And of course, it becomes this perfect tool for propaganda, right?
Mhm.
Especially in the politically turbulent, I mean, it's not politically turbulent, but especially in the early 20th century.
Absolutely. And then you couple that with the rise of consumerism and advertising and the individual. They become both the center of attention and the target of these new forms of social control.
It's kind of a chilling thought, isn't it? That the individual becomes more aware of themselves,
Yeah.
more introspective, but at the same time, more susceptible to these external forces of manipulation.
It's a strange paradox, isn't it? And art reflects this tension as well. Just as occultism was seeking these answers from within, you see these art movements like Cubism, Expressionism, Surrealism. They break away from these traditional forms, right? And they're trying to capture that inner turmoil of the modern psyche.
Yeah, like Picasso.
Exactly.
It's like art was trying to make sense of a world that was becoming increasingly, well, fragmented,
Yeah.
chaotic, difficult to understand.
And let's not forget about those darker manifestations of this modern mentality, like the rise of totalitarian regimes.
Right.
The 20th century, unfortunately, tragically, it demonstrated the consequences of these unchecked ideologies, right?
Right.
With horrors like Stalin's purges and Hitler's genocide.
It's terrifying to see how those movements were able to exploit, the very trends we've been talking about, mass media, propaganda, the anxieties and aspirations of the masses, and all to seize power and just crush dissent.
And they often co-opted the language of progress, even of science, to justify their atrocities. Like the Nazis twisting Darwin's theory of evolution to support their racist ideology. A chilling example, to say the least.
So where does that leave us? With all this historical and philosophical baggage,
Yeah.
what can we even learn from this journey through the roots of, well, the modern world? It's a lot to unpack.
It is a lot. And that's the big question, isn't it? What happens when those utopian visions, they turn nightmarish? When technology becomes this tool for, well, manipulation? When the search for meaning, what happens when that leads to the abyss?
It's a heavy question. I mean, it feels like we've been wrestling with this question throughout our entire deep dive.
Yeah.
Can we actually learn from history? Or are we, I don't know, are we doomed to just repeat all of the mistakes?
Well, our sources, they offer some fascinating, if not always comforting, perspectives on this.
Right.
Take Lala, for example. He was already warning about the dangers of technology, right? About technology becoming this all-encompassing force. And this was back in the mid-20th century.
It's true. And look where we are now. It's like he was speaking directly to us.
He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. Even back then, he was talking about technology's potential to reshape not just our world, but our very way of thinking.
Yeah, and it's not just the technology itself, it's how it's used, right?
Exactly. And it ties into those concerns about individual autonomy that we've been, circling back to this whole time. If technology can be used to manipulate us, if we're increasingly immersed in this digital world, I mean, where does that leave our sense of self, our capacity for free thought?
It can feel a little overwhelming, to be honest. Are we just cogs in the machine, destined to be, I don't know, molded by forces beyond our control?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Our sources also highlight this remarkable, resilience, the resilience of the human spirit.
Okay, I like that.
Think about those individuals, right? The ones who stood up to totalitarian regimes, the artists who challenged those, suffocating social norms, the thinkers who dared to question everything.
It's true. Those stories of individual courage, of creativity, they're incredibly inspiring.
They remind us that even in the darkest of times, even when the odds seem, totally stacked against us, there's always this potential, right, for resistance, for pushing back, for forging a different path.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all.
But it does feel like, a call to action. We can't just be passive observers of history, right? Just watching it unfold around us. We have to be participants.
Exactly. We have to engage with it, but critically. And that means, understanding these long historical trends, these patterns of progress, and let's face it, regression of utopian dreams turning into, well, nightmares. It's about understanding the tools that are being used to shape how we think, how we behave.
Because it's only then, right?
Yeah.
If we understand all of that, only then can we make conscious choices about the kind of future we want to create. So, as we sort of wrap up this deep dive, what are some key insights that you think our listeners can take away? What do you hope will stick with them?
I think first and foremost, the interconnectedness of it all.
Right.
I mean, we've seen how these religious beliefs, philosophical ideas, these art movements, these political revolutions, they all flow into one another, shaping this Western worldview that, we've inherited.
We really have. It's like we've been tracing these invisible threads that connect all these, seemingly disparate events and ideas, but across centuries.
It's mind-blowing, and it's exactly why understanding history is so important. And I don't just mean memorizing dates and names, though that's important too, but really perceiving these patterns, these recurring tensions. It's about understanding how the past continues to shape, well, right now.
One of those recurring tensions, I think, is that balance, right? Between individual freedom and then the needs of the collective, between autonomy and control. It feels like that tension is only amplified right now in our current moment with social media, data collection, all these new technologies that can be used to both empower us and to manipulate us.
It's a double-edged sword, for sure. And that brings us to another key takeaway, I think. The critical importance of critical thinking. We are just bombarded with information from all sides. I mean, think about it. News, social media, advertising, it's relentless.
It never stops.
And we have to be able to sift through all that noise. We have to question what we're being told and then form, our own judgments.
Because as we've seen, throughout history, even seemingly rational, valid, logical arguments, they can be used to justify, well, the most horrific actions.
Yeah.
And that's a chilling reminder that we just can't afford to be complacent. We can't just sit back and let things happen.
We have to be active participants. And this critical engagement, it should extend to the art and culture we consume as well,
Yes.
Art isn't just this reflection of society. It's also this powerful force, right, that shapes our values, our beliefs, our understanding of, well, everything.
It's like a feedback loop, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
Art reflects our reality, but it also influences how we perceive that reality.
Precisely. So it's about being conscious consumers and creators of culture. It's about recognizing the power of stories, of images, of ideas to shape not just our own lives, but the course of history itself.
So it's not enough to simply understand the past. We have to actively participate in creating, well, what comes next. And that requires courage, imagination, a willingness to challenge, the status quo.
It does. And maybe, most importantly, it requires a sense of hope.
Yes.
Hope that we can learn from the mistakes of the past. Hope that we can use our knowledge and our creativity to build a better future.
I love that. So well said. And with that, we'll leave you, our intrepid listener, with this final thought.
Right.
As you go about your day, as you move through the world, just pay attention. Pay attention to those recurring patterns, those echoes of the past and the present. Because it's by understanding those forces, the forces that have shaped our world, that we gain a measure of power, I think, to shape its future.
And who knows, maybe, just maybe, we can create a future that's worthy of this long, strange, incredible trip that brought us here.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep those minds hungry and stay curious.